There's something you might want that you've never said out loud. Not because it's shameful, not because it's wrong, but because it doesn't sound like enough. You want a life that is smaller than the one you're supposed to want, quieter, less witnessed, less optimized. A life with more mornings like this one, and fewer performances. If that sounds familiar, this video is for you. We are living through the most documented period in human history. Every meal, every milestone, every carefully curated version of a Tuesday afternoon, photographed, captioned, published, measured. And somewhere in all of that documentation, the actual living gets thinner. We've built a world where the experience and the record of the experience happen simultaneously, where the sunset and the photo of the sunset compete for your attention, where the feeling and the performance of the feeling have become almost impossible to separate. Philosophers have a word for this kind of existence. They call it inauthenticity. Not dishonesty exactly, not lying, but a kind of drift, away from what you actually feel, toward what you're supposed to feel, away from what you actually want, toward what you're supposed to want, away from your own life, toward the version of your life that performs well for others. And the strange thing is, most people know this is happening. They feel it quietly as a kind of low-level exhaustion. Not burnout from overwork, something more specific than that. The exhaustion of being watched. So here is the want that nobody talks about. The want for a life that doesn't need to be explained, that doesn't need to be justified to anyone. Not to your parents, not to your followers, not to the imaginary audience that lives rent-free in the back of your mind, evaluating everything you do. A life where you read the book because the book interests you, not because it makes you look interesting. Where you take the walk because walking feels good, not because the step count validates the walk. Where you make the meal, tend the plant, sit with the thought, because it is quietly and sufficiently its own reward. This isn't laziness, it isn't giving up. It is, in fact, one of the most difficult things a person can do in this particular moment in history. To want something small and mean it. To resist the voice that says, "But what will you have to show for it?" To answer calmly, "Nothing." And to be okay with that. This isn't a new idea. Almost every philosophical tradition in human history has pointed, in some form, toward the same thing. The Stoics called it living according to nature, meaning not according to the expectations of the crowd, but according to what is genuinely good and genuinely yours. Marcus Aurelius, who was arguably the most powerful man in the world during his lifetime, spent his private journals not recording his conquests, but reminding himself to want less, to notice more, to be present in the small and the ordinary. The Taoists spoke of wu wei, a kind of effortless action. Not passivity, but a way of moving through life without forcing it, without performing it, without making it into something it isn't. The Japanese concept of mai, the meaningful pause, the space between things, suggests that the gaps in a life are not empty. They are where depth lives. Every tradition, from every corner of the world, pointing at the same quiet truth. That the loud life, the witnessed life, the performed life, is not by itself a meaningful one. And yet, it is extraordinarily hard to want the quiet life and actually live it, not because it requires great effort, but because it requires ignoring a very loud, very persistent voice. The voice that says, "You could be doing more." The voice that measures your worth in output, in visibility, in the size of what you're building. The voice that looks at a quiet Tuesday, a walk, a book, a conversation that went nowhere in particular, and calls it a waste. That voice is not your own. It was given to you by school systems that ranked and graded, by platforms designed to make invisibility feel like failure, by a culture that has confused busy with valuable and loud with important. You absorbed it so early that it feels like your own conscience. But it isn't. Underneath that voice is something quieter, something that already knows what it wants and has been waiting patiently for permission to want it. So here is the permission if you need it. You are allowed to want a life that isn't impressive. You are allowed to find more meaning in a slow morning than in a packed schedule. You are allowed to measure your days not by what you produced, but by whether you were present in them. You are allowed to care more about the depth of your relationships than the breadth of your network. To find that enough has always been enough. You just weren't allowed to say so. This is not a small thing. In a world that profits from your dissatisfaction, that needs you to believe you're always slightly behind, always slightly lacking, choosing sufficiency is a quiet act of resistance. Not rebellion for its own sake. Not opting out because the world is bad, but opting in to something more real, to the life that was always there underneath the noise, waiting to be uncovered. The quiet life nobody talks about wanting is wanted by almost everyone. They just don't say it out loud because it doesn't sound like enough, because they're afraid of what it means about their ambition, their drive, their worth. But meaning was never measured in volume. It was never found in the applause. It was always here, in the small, the slow, the real, in the life you actually live when nobody is watching. That life is not a consolation. It is the whole point.